you so much for having me here to talk about what it looks like to have effective solutions for climate change education. So as Janet mentioned, I'm an environmental education coordinator at EGLE, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. I have only been in that position about 3 months, so I'm still kind of getting settled in the state government. But as you heard, been in environmental education for a while now. And some of you maybe have interacted with me in the past around watershed and water quality education when I was at Algro. So now at EGLE, as Janet mentioned, my work involves building environmental literacy around our agency's work to protect Michigan's environment and public resources, public health, by managing air, water, land, and energy resources. So we're here today talking about solution-forward climate change education. So just a quick overview of the topics we'll be covering today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons that a solution-forward approach to climate change education is important. We'll look at some examples of what that looks like, and then I'll share some resources for further research for you and your students, and also to help further your own education. All right, so if you have a pen or a piece of paper handy, I want you to think about this question. We're here today to talk about climate change, which for a lot of people, even just saying the words can bring up some kind of strong feelings. And I really want us to acknowledge that those feelings exist and think about how those feelings can prompt us to improve our climate change education. So if you've got a pencil and paper, or you've got a page of notes open on your computer that you're taking notes on, think of the words climate change and then just jot down the first thing that comes to mind. It could be a word, a phrase, it could be a color, it could be an image that you're thinking of. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be detailed, it could be vague. Just think about what comes to mind. And when I've done this activity in the past, a lot of times the responses that come back are not overly positive. There's a lot of, fear, there's anger, there's distress, there's frustration. And I just want you to, for a moment, put yourself in the shoes of the young people who we're teaching and think about, if you're a young person, this is all you're hearing about your future. How's that going to make you feel? And how is that going to make you, what is that going to make you want to do? So we're going to move forward with talking about how to address that, because a lot of times people feel demotivated or distressed by climate change. I want you to recognize, as educators who are here today, that you are working hard, you're taking steps to address this, and that for today, for this very moment that we're here, just learning about how to improve your education is positive, is a good step. So don't beat yourself up too much if you feel like you're not a good climate change educator. We're all learning how to be better at this. When it comes to young people, climate change often brings feelings of really intense anxiety, which is no wonder, right? It's the defining challenge of our generation, and we are constantly bombarded with news about it. So just this week, we got a new report from the IPCC, which warns us that climate is changing even more rapidly than we had expected. And scientists around the world are concerned that we won't be able to adapt quickly enough to some of the changes that are just completely unavoidable already. And this will impact around 3.5 billion people who live in what the report calls contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Many of these are really vulnerable populations, as you've been talking about all throughout this series. The young, the elderly, the poor, people of color, they're the ones who are struggling more than most in relation to this problem. This is really interesting because it's also the first IPCC report that clearly links changing climate to mental health struggles. So we see that heat waves have already been linked to increases in psychiatric admissions, to mental health issues like the way that your body metabolizes medication, to problems associated with loss of sleep because of heat, with increases in domestic disturbances as the temperature goes up. We know that natural disasters cause long-term trauma for a lot of people. And social scientists and behavioral scientists are really researching now, what does it mean to have climate anxiety, this just long-term dread about what your future holds. It's important that we understand this anxiety because it lays the basis for why I believe we need to take this solution-forward or solution-focused approach. So there was a study that came out in December of 2021 in the Lancet Planetary Health. And what they did was they surveyed 10,000 children in 10 countries about climate anxiety and their beliefs about how they felt about how governments responded to climate change. And the results aren't surprising, but they are to me as an educator, kind of upsetting. So 75% overall of these youth said that their future was frightening. 83% said that they believe people had failed to take care of the planet. The graphic here is showing a breakdown of, and it's kind of maybe small on your screen, but you can look at it up close when I get you the slides. But it's a breakdown of how people in different countries, how youth in different countries felt at their level of worry and how they were affected in their daily life. So 59% overall are either very or extremely worried about climate change. 84% are moderately worried at least. And what really kind of broke my heart is this number of like almost half, 45% said their feelings negatively affected their daily life and functioning. So we've got kids dealing with this major crisis here, and they don't feel like people are doing anything about it. This same article found really profound feelings of betrayal among young people by their government, by people in power who haven't been doing anything to help them. One of the articles in the New York Times this week that was talking about the new report describes the report this way. Written by 270 researchers from 67 countries, the report is an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. With fact upon fact, this report reveals how people and the planet are getting clobbered by climate change. Whew, when I read that, I think, wow, it's no surprise that youth are feeling betrayed by the way governments have acted to address climate change, because we're constantly telling them that nothing has happened. So these feelings of anxiety are telling us something. They're telling us that climate change education is more than about teaching hard science. It's more than about teaching the facts. We know it's the challenge of our time. Young people have been hearing about climate change from very, very early ages. And we do need to combat disinformation, and we do need to ensure that they're hearing the facts about climate change. We also need to recognize that there's a real serious social and emotional side to this issue that we've got to be intentional about dealing with as we educate our youth. Just want to mention that young people are not the only ones feeling anxious about climate change, as evidenced maybe by the feelings that you had when I asked you to write down how you were feeling. In the Yale Climate Change Communication Program does this survey of American opinions about climate change every several years, 5 years or so. So the last one was in 2019, and they found that 2 out of 3 Americans are at least somewhat worried about global warming, is the phrasing they used, which kind of wish that was a little bit higher, but that is a 10% increase since the previous report 5 years earlier. Interestingly, 3 in 10 Americans are very worried, which seems like a more appropriate level of worry to me. And that's a 3-fold increase since 2014. So adults' opinions are changing. They're becoming more concerned about this problem. And they also experienced really mixed emotions about climate change. One thing I think is really interesting is if you can see the bottom 3 bars on this graph are how many adults feel, what percentage of adults feel ashamed, guilty, or courageous about global warming. And I don't know, part of me wonders if like maybe the fact that those numbers are really low has something to do with why youth feel like adults aren't doing anything about climate change. Because adults don't feel like they're responsible for it, maybe. I don't know. That hasn't been studied. That's my personal opinion. So take that with a grain of salt. So it's important that we validate this distress that young people are feeling and recognize that there's this sense of betrayal that might not just be from government, but from older generations as a whole. And this doesn't mean that we need to downplay the severity of the crisis. It just means that recognizing that only sharing the facts and the doom and the gloom and the scary stuff isn't a full accounting of the picture. So we need to share the progress that's happening as well as the crisis we're in if we want to be fully honest with our students. And we also need to help them build the tools to be emotionally resilient in this really difficult time. So let's think about what to do next, because that's all really depressing and sad. So far we've been talking about how climate change makes us feel, how we're stressed out, how we're anxious. And now we're going to kind of transition to why those feelings are important in pointing us towards what to do next, pointing us towards a solution-focused approach. So I want to share with you some of the research that points to the problem with doom and gloom, and talk about the importance of hope and the central place that love can play and should play in our work as environmental educators. As we've talked about, it's important to know the facts. It's important to understand exactly where we stand before we try to fix things. But too much focus on doom, it can have the opposite effect. A constant barrage of negative news can leave you feeling helpless, and that's demotivating and disempowering. And the last thing we want to do with something as complex and urgent as climate change is to demotivate people and make them feel like they should just give up. So you're probably familiar, maybe you haven't heard of it. There's a great newsletter that comes out of Harvard called The Climate Optimist, which I really enjoy. And there was an issue a while back that was titled, "We Interrupt Your Doom Scrolling with a Message from Reality." And I just loved it because it talked about the reality is that we're hardwired as humans to focus on the negative. It's what grabs our attention. And when all the information we consume is negative, we know that that can lead to mental health problems. And unfortunately, a lot of the writings that we hear about climate change, both in the media, in the news, and social media, even in textbooks, it can focus on the negative because it grabs our attention and it sticks. This leads us to the infamous doom scrolling on our phones, which, as anyone who has ever been caught up in that knows, doesn't leave you feeling empowered or motivated. Just leaves you feeling like you need to kind of binge on Netflix and ice cream instead and just shut out the world. So that's not what we're going for. We're going for action. So there was a couple startling statements in that article that I mentioned, and this was one of them. They said climate doom is the new climate denial because it's just as effective at creating inaction. To be hopeless is to be uninformed because we're saturated by gloomy news stories that don't accurately reflect climate progress. The truth is that when we talk about hope, we're not preventing people from taking action. We're actually helping them stay motivated, to stay engaged, and to keep working. And so some of these statements are, I was curious about that. So I wanted to see kind of what does the research look like around that? And it's true, there's a source cited on here. There's a bunch of research about hope and climate change education. But this was an interesting one. This source specifically listed or studied how climate change education focusing on hope affected the actual knowledge gaining and the behaviors and actions of young people. And they found that hope is really important, but not just any kind of hope. So there's this hope based on denial, that classic sort of like sticking your head in the sand kind of soap and just kind of hope and just assuming everything's going to be okay. That kind of hope is delusional. It's disconnected from reality and it's counterproductive. It actually leads to less engagement because people know that it's false. There's another type of hope, though, that's called constructive hope. And constructive hope was a very strong predictor of engagement and action in environmental protection in this study. So constructive hope is this approach that practices what's called positive reappraisal. So reframing this situation that's really bad in a different light that helps you accentuate some of the good as opposed to only the bad. Constructive hope acknowledges both the reality of the situation we're in and how bad it is, but it also acknowledges the power that we have to change that situation. The concept of hope is related to a number of theories and recommendations from the social sciences. And some of these are tools that we can use to help build our own skills and our student skills in positive reappraisal and the building of self-efficacy in addressing climate change problems. So two of them I just want to mention, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, are appreciative inquiry and asset framing as really helpful approaches. So appreciative inquiry is a model that engages stakeholders in self-determining change. So it's based on the idea that we overuse this problem-solving mentality. And it's important to, which maybe for those of us who like problem-based learning, we're like, wait a second, we like problem focus. But if you only focus on problems, too much focus on problems hinders your ability to find solutions in reality. And so in other words, you're starting with the strengths of where you're at, identifying what you're aspiring to. Don't start with the problem and what you're missing. Asset framing is a similar approach, asks us to take a strengths-based approach to looking at the people and the organizations that we're working with. So it defines people by their assets and their aspirations before noting their challenges and their deficits. It focuses on what people bring to society and what's good about their lives. One of the really well-known people in this field, his name is Trabian Shorters. He describes this as a way of describing everyone with dignity. And I've linked on here a series of really interesting short interviews with him where he describes the development of this construct and how to apply it, which is really wonderful and really valuable in our discussions of environmental justice and how we describe the people and the communities who are affected by climate change. Because imagine if you had to introduce yourself every day based on your worst trait or your most embarrassing or the worst thing that ever happened to you. That's not going to make you feel very motivated. It's going to be embarrassing. And so asset framing says we should be giving everybody the benefit of being introduced and being understood based on their best parts. So this leads us to develop some other, or to consider some other ways that we can help our youth and our audiences develop mindsets of positivity and self-efficacy. And there's been a lot of research around how youth develop environmental values. The ones that are listed here are the result of a really big literature review that happened in 2008. And there's some debate over the value of assigning specific ages or specific stages to this development. But in general, I think that's, especially if you hold it kind of loosely, there's a really helpful construct for understanding the way that our values develop. And so in early childhood, what we know is that children tend to engage with nature most from a place of empathy, particularly associated with animals. So that doesn't mean that you can't talk about non-living things or the weather or things like that. It just means that approaches that will resonate most with children will allow them the space to make direct connections to nature and to get up close and personal with creatures and things that move. It doesn't have to be animals only, it could be bugs. And those things help them begin to build a relationship with the natural world and to feel a connection to it that can grow as they get older. So as they do get a little bit older, we know that kids develop more physical control over their bodies and more mental and emotional sort of independence and separation from their caregivers. And at this point, they get really excited about exploration. And again, the most effective forms of environmental education will allow them opportunities to explore physically, intellectually, the environment around them. And again, you know, these are important elements of environmental education, climate education at any age, but they're going to resonate particularly well with this age group. It's not until adolescence that children are developmentally able to process completely the ideas of themselves as part of a larger whole, as part of a group, as social responsibility. Just like we talk about, you know, your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until your mid-20s, and that's how we explain some of the crazy stuff that teenagers do, you know, the bad decisions that they make. It's the same kind of idea here. We can't expect children who are younger than adolescents to really fully understand the implications and the way that some of these what to them feel very abstract systems work and global interconnectedness and social responsibility. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't start introducing concepts of mutuality and interconnectedness at younger ages. It just, we should, but in, you know, simplified ways. And we can't place the responsibility for solving these huge, global, really complicated problems that we as adults can't solve. We can't place that on kids who are too young to handle it. And there's some research that suggests too much of that at too young of an age can lead to lifelong disempowerment and disengagement in environmental issues. So we got to be careful. There's a quote you might hear frequently, those of you who work in the place-based education sphere, from a writer named David Sobel. And he argues that we should not introduce tragedies, which he defines as big, complex problems beyond the geographical and conceptual scope of young children. We shouldn't introduce those before 4th grade. And that's sort of basically based on the same things I just said. There's been some really interesting discussion around this statement and what it means for climate change specifically. And I wanted to share with you this one resource that I was looking into as I looked at David Sobel's statement. And this paper looked at what experts around this area of climate change education felt about how to introduce this tragedy to younger children. And they did extensive interviews with these experts on what they thought you should do and shouldn't do, and they pulled these themes out. And it does support adding some nuance to the statement of, the sort of relatively hard line statement of no tragedies before 4th grade. But I think on overall, we kind of underscore the same idea. And some of these things, a lot of these things, I know teachers who are doing all these things, not necessarily in regard to climate change, but other environmental issues. So I did a lot of work with watersheds. So I know a lot of teachers who are integrating, connections with the community and critical thinking and time outdoors, and media exposure, all of that into their watershed education. For some reason, we're a little more hesitant to do that with climate change. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple minutes. But the really important things that I wanted to note out of here were, one, that very first one, the importance of offsetting information, the data, the scary reports, with positive action. And these pieces about including the emotional side, how important that is. And sometimes with climate change, it's hard for us to make that mental connection between our relationship with nature and the outdoor world and outdoor education, and then climate change. It's sometimes hard for us to connect those two. We think, well, there's outdoor environmental education and then there's climate change, but there's actually a really strong connection between spending time in nature, feeling a love for a particular place, and acting on that and taking action to protect it. The other really important thing I want to point out again is the importance of including emotions and feelings in teaching and learning about climate change. And that refers to really helping youth process those feelings of angst that they might have around what their future looks like. So that the critique around, focusing on developmental stages sometimes focuses on the fact that not everyone goes through stages in life at the same time. So just like physical development, there's kind of a continuum of what's normal. So we can't, it's the same with these environmental values. There's adults who aren't even on the scale of this. The point is that we're building over time environmental literacy and environmental awareness. And what a lot of researchers agree on is the idea that we protect, we care for what we love, that love motivates action. John Burroughs was a naturalist and who was writing in the 1870s, and talked about this idea that, and you've seen this in action, right? Anybody who's an educator has seen this. If kids are excited about something, they really like it, they're interested in it, that knowledge is going to stick. And so that's why that investment of time, especially in the early years, in teaching people to love and care for a place, is the basis for action. If you may or may not recognize the image on this slide, there's a music video that is not appropriate for me to play on this presentation titled "We Love the Earth," that is actually a really brilliant example of an artist who really understands his audience and what is going to connect to them, and using that to bring forth that idea of caring for something that you love. So if you happen to Google that later, just know that there are some bad words in it and that the song is a major earworm and you're going to not be able to stop singing it. So an important part of climate change education is focusing on solutions that are motivated by love for the earth, by love for specific places on the earth. And it's critical that we teach climate change within the context of this broader effort to care for this place that we love. This is probably the most well-known David Sobel quote anybody's ever heard, and it's one of my favorites too, is that we need to let them being children, wallow in and love the earth before we ask them to save it. Just respecting that need for them to develop a relationship there. And we're often asking our kids to strive for something that they have a really hard time visualizing. So, we want you to have a healthy planet, a strong future, no greenhouse gas emissions, when a lot of our youth have no really healthy baseline knowledge of what a functioning ecosystem looks like. They don't, or a functioning planet, they know that things are bad and getting worse. And if we want them to understand what to strive for, and if we want them to want to strive for it, we have to give them time to get out there and explore the good things and come to love them. Okay, this is the good part. It's all good, but here's one of my favorite parts. So we know we need to provide opportunities to fall in love for nature, and we need to include solutions and positive stories. But what does that look like? So some of you are probably familiar through other presentations you've gotten with the STEM Teaching Tools resources. STEM Teaching Tools is a website which has a lot of tools for teaching STEM, but they have a whole climate literacy or a climate learning section that is really fantastic, really goes deep into the pedagogy around environmental education with climate change and around resources for learning more about how to do it. So some of these principles are pulled from there. Some of these principles are pulled from this resource on the slide here, which is a really large scale systematic review of research around climate change education. And I will say these things are validated by my personal experience in climate change education. I find that they work. So I'm going to give you four sort of themes and ideas to think about when educating around climate change from a solution perspective. So first, and this is not surprising, right? It's a common finding from all kinds of environmental education, but especially climate, is that it needs to be personally relevant to young people. They've got to understand what the drivers, the impacts, the solutions of climate change look like in places that they know and love. This is a culturally responsive manner of educating because it responds to the communities and the values that people hold. It shouldn't shy away from addressing justice and equity. And in fact, we see that many young people, for many of them, this love of a place and of a community combined with understanding of the unequal effects of climate change can really be a powerful motivator. And just like with all science learning and really any learning in general, it needs to incorporate hands-on elements. They need to do something. So get outside, measure the temperature of different surfaces. What does it look like on a parking lot versus a grassy field versus a forest? What does your local stream look like? What's your water quality? What's the temperature? How does the temperature in the stream change as you go upstream and downstream? Why are certain areas flooding in the city but not in other areas? So have them engage in these hands-on investigations in their own community. There's a reason that our national science standards have such a strong emphasis on the engineering design process right now, and it's because it is such a powerful learning tool. So when we're doing a solution-focused approach to education, to climate change education, we're going to place the facts about climate change within the context of change making a positive change. So this recognizes that the data and the scary reports and all that are information that is an input into our design process. And as we expand our view of climate change information as an input to this design process, and when we base our solutions on known community needs, we're engaging in this process that people gave a fancy term to, which is multi-solving. Basically finding solutions that solve a wide variety of problems. So, I reach back to my watershed education days here, not that long ago, designing and building a rain garden. So this can be a climate change solution, right? Because we are managing the excess stormwater runoff that's coming caused by changing climate patterns. Climate change solution. We're also improving biodiversity. We're also supporting pollinators. We're providing a place for outdoor learning. We're providing a beautiful asset to our community. We're helping improve local water quality. We're solving a lot of problems with one thing. And practicing these skills, both within the classroom and then out in the community, helps students understand that their work is valuable and it makes a difference. As you're going through this process, we really need to keep in mind the importance of education. The goal of education, environmental education in particular, is to build student skills. So one of the hallmarks of effective environmental education is that it teaches students how to think about environmental issues and not what to think. So we need to allow our students to have conversations where they can compare different ideas, debate viewpoints respectfully. So this deliberative dialogue link here has some really awesome resources for how to do that within a classroom. Give them a chance to learn, to be curious, to ask questions, allow them to design and test ideas, even and maybe especially the ones that you are pretty sure will fail, and be willing to listen to them. Even if you already know kind of what you want to do, let that youth voice guide the process of the classroom because they need to know that their voice matters in order to be encouraged to continue doing this work. One of the resources I'm going to recommend later is an organization called Youth Voices for the Planet. If you haven't heard from them, check them out. It's really cool. They make these short documentaries of incredible work that students are doing to protect the earth all over, and they're really, really fun. And there's one really good one about a group of students in Miami at a middle school who were interested in energy improvements at their school. They have, over the past 2 years, helped their school save over $50,000 in energy costs. It's incredible. And they're taking what they learn now and they're applying it at the high school that they're at. And it was possible because there were teachers and administrators, facilities personnel who were willing to listen to these ideas that the kids had and to let them run with it. So there's amazing things that can happen if we listen to the kids. And then the final theme in the sort of how-to section is the importance of giving students opportunities to engage in science with scientists out in the field. So when they were with an active scientist, that really ignites their imagination, broadens their understanding of what career opportunities look like, and it can motivate them to collect their own data. There are literally hundreds of, maybe thousands of citizen science, community science programs out there that youth can contribute to, that anybody can contribute to. So I linked a couple here that are relevant to climate change, but again, there's hundreds of them. And allowing students to learn more about the process of science, about what's happening in their own communities, what kinds of activities they can take to make a difference. That's all a part of these community science efforts. And it also provides them with opportunities to learn how to use new technology as they collect and visualize and analyze data. And that's all skills that are necessary for creating climate solutions. I am not going to go into this slide in detail, but I wanted it to be in here so you can look at it later. In essence, what I'm telling you is with climate change education, we need to take the same approach that we take with other environmental issues. And that's to address it not only from the science pillar, but all the pillars of sustainability, the people, planet, profit, the science, the social side, the economic side, the cultural side. And this can be really scary because more than most, climate change is a very politically charged issue. And you don't want to get calls from parents or problems with your principal or whatever from talking about it. This is where I tell people, one of the wonderful things about incorporating student voice into your teaching is that when someone calls you mad, you can say, I didn't bring that up, a student brought that up. That was their idea, we were just exploring it. So just a suggestion, you could try that. But again, we're not understanding the full picture if we don't incorporate all of these aspects. And so our goal is on helping students fully understand this problem and recognizing just the incredible reservoir of power and strength that youth have to make change in this area. I mean, when you think about the most powerful climate change movements out there right now, they're all led by youth. So don't discount the work that they can do. I always tell people, youth are not, these kids that we're teaching are not, the environmental leaders of the future. They're the environmental leaders today already. They're amazing. So I'm not going to go into a long story about all these, but I wanted to share a few resources that I found really useful teaching about climate change at a variety of scales and from a variety of perspectives. So general climate education resources, if you've been part of these webinars, I'm sure you've seen probably all of them at one point. I do want to point out just, again, the STEM teaching tools, really, really helpful. Also the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, CLEAN. I find this website so useful because they've curated climate change education resources to be the very best of the best that are out there on the internet. So it's going to be good. And they have all the NGSS alignments in there so that if you are a classroom teacher, you can really make the case to your administrators about why that's a good lesson that you're using. Don't forget about the climate literacy principles. And if you, again, need to make crosswalks between those and the NGSS, there are some really good resources at the North American Association for Environmental Education, NAAE, that connect the ocean literacy and climate literacy principles to the next generation science standards. So I can get you those resources if you're interested in those. So lots of resources on just like climate education in general. I want to share a few Michigan specific things with you. In Michigan, EAGLE is the office that is tasked with managing climate change research and planning. So the EAGLE Office of Climate and Energy is where you're going to find a lot of resources. The Michigan Healthy Climate Plan is currently being developed and should be on the governor's desk. I think by Earth Day is the plan right now. So keep an eye out for that to see what the state is doing and what the state is planning, and check around in your local communities. Maybe your city or your county has a climate plan that you can look at too to see how that's playing out at the local level. The other really interesting thing I want to point out is the second link, the Michigan Environmental Public Health Tracking Data. So this is actually run by Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and they track things like heat indexes and tick-borne diseases and how all that relates to a changing climate. And it's super interesting. I will note that EGLE's website, where you can get data and information and everything, is undergoing a big redesign. So by mid-April, when you go to michigan.gov/EGLE, there will be right up front a drop-down menu for data and maps. It'll be really easy to, it's not super easy to find it right now, will be super easy by mid-April. So check back. If you have students that are in the kind of like upper elementary, middle school, starting out younger in high school, check out our webinar that we've got coming up in April, our pre-Earth Day webinar for students around specifically what the state is doing to address climate change. So if you're interested in that, that is a webinar that will be led by staff from within our agency to talk about the work we're doing directly to students. And we're going to have some pre and post resources for students available as well. That'll be up on our website very soon. So just a little plug for that. And then resources that are solution oriented. Again, you're probably super familiar with Drawdown and the Eco Challenge by this point. There's a few others that I really want to address. One of them is the solutions journalism. If you have not checked out this project before, it's really incredible. It addresses this problem we talked about at the beginning of how, you know, our news media likes to talk about the negative because it grabs our attention. And it is a project, you know, of the media, you know, for the media to help grow their ability to tell positive stories, to tell about the solutions to problems that are happening. And they've got some really, really awesome resources that help educators learn how to integrate their stories into the classroom. And there's a whole climate collection, but there's lots of other topics too. So it's a really cool resource. And again, interdisciplinary, maybe if you want to connect with your ELA teacher or social studies or something. The other one I really want to point out here is the All We Can Save Educators Toolbox. So All We Can Save, this is a book that came out somewhere within the past year, I think, and it's a collection of essays and poems and writing, all by women, many of them women of color, about their relationship to climate change. And it's really awesome. And they have developed this just fantastic toolbox for educators to implement in the classroom. And again, some of that, it's very solution focused. It really focuses on what do we need to do? What do we need to do? If you want to talk further about this, please feel free to reach out at any time. My contact info is on here. Visit our EGLE Classroom website for more resources. We're still working on adding more things on there. If you've got things you want to share, send them my way. And if you're interested in getting connected to a scientist or someone at the state that you maybe want to have speak to your audience or answer questions, let me know and I can do my best to connect you to somebody who would be good for that purpose.